So there are three things that the lieutenant governor can do that I'm particularly excited about. The first is that the lieutenant governor is the bridge between the governor's office and cities and towns. So if you think about it, cities and towns are where a lot of the issues that affect ordinary people happen. So housing, transportation, education, the opioid crisis. In many ways, these are local issues. And the lieutenant governor is well situated to be an ally and an advocate for cities and towns as they grapple with these important issues. Second role that I think is particularly important is we have an important set of relationships with the broken and dysfunctional federal government. So ICE comes in and does raids on our businesses. We have block grants. We have Medicaid waivers. And I think having a lawyer who worked in the White House, worked for a member of Congress, worked in the Commerce Department, as part of the governor's senior team, I think I could help navigate those important but very complex issues. And then third, the lieutenant governor serves as the chair of the Governor's Council. I think it would be a wonderful platform for a lawyer who cares about civil rights to really lead on reforming our broken criminal justice system. So we imprison too many people for too long for doing too little, and race has too much to do with who ends up in the criminal justice system. We've made important progress on this. There was a landmark bill that the governor signed this week, but there's so much more to do. I'd like to use the office of the lieutenant governor as a platform for moving forward, building on that accomplishment, but also taking the next step in terms of trying to reform some of our system around pretrial detention, some of the way that we help people re-enter society and take away some of the obstacles that people face as they re-enter their communities, and also making sure that we really grapple with substance use disorder and mental health challenges that are often faced by people both inside the criminal justice system and as they come out into their communities. So I think that the lieutenant governor can do those three things. I'd also add that I think that it's really important as people are considering who to elect as lieutenant governor, that you can picture that person performing the duties as governor. Because sometimes there is occasion for the lieutenant governor to step up and have to take on those responsibilities. If the governor is out of the jurisdiction, the lieutenant governor often needs to take on those responsibilities. So I think it's really important to elect a lieutenant governor who's ready on day one to perform the responsibilities of governor, even if that's an infrequent occurrence. I think that the conventional wisdom 6 months ago was that Charlie Baker is a formidable candidate for re-election. And I think that the conventional wisdom is changing somewhat. And I think part of that has to do with a blue wave that is building across the country. So we've seen in some other states, in Virginia and New Jersey, but also in Alabama and in Pennsylvania, the Democrats are doing particularly well as we articulate a vision about the ways in which the Republicans have taken the country in the wrong direction. I think that we're seeing that in Massachusetts as well. Last week we won a state rep seat in Attleboro, and our results in a lot of the special elections and the local elections have been very strong. And I think that we've been involved in campaigns in the past where we've respected and empowered and included people at the local level. And what I want to do is build a grassroots movement from the Berkshires to the Cape that really gets people involved in taking back the corner office. And I think that when we've had campaigns where people meet the candidate or when people talk neighbor to neighbor, we've seen that is what has the best results. We're going to have a very high level of turnout, I think, in this general election. We're going to have Elizabeth Warren on the ballot. We're going to have the minimum wage on the ballot. If this SJC lets it go forward, we'll have the millionaire's tax on the ballot. And so I think that that's going to pull out some really progressive voters. I also think that we as statewide candidates need to make a case against Charlie Baker. And the fact is that Charlie Baker has not led. If you ask people what they like about Charlie Baker, it's generally one of two things. Either they say that he's kind of a nice guy, or they say that he's not as bad as Trump. But when you actually ask them, what has he accomplished that you care about? You ask them, do you like his record on education, on transportation, on the opioid crisis, on climate change? People don't tend to be able to identify things that he's accomplished because he hasn't accomplished very much. And I think what we need to do as people tune into this race is make the case for what we are going to do to lead. So I think we need to raise the minimum wage, $15 an hour. We need paid paid family leave. We need a millionaire's tax that will give us the resources to really invest in transportation and in education. We need real leadership on the opioid crisis, on climate change. And these are all areas where Charlie Baker's record is not strong, and we need to draw that contrast. The other thing is that he's run on this notion that he's a terrific manager. And I think we've seen issue by issue that that's just not true, whether that's the state police, or that's the DOR, or that's the state bond rating, or that's the RMV. We're seeing example after example of where he passes the buck and he doesn't take responsibility when his administration doesn't serve the needs of ordinary people. So I don't pretend that this is going to be an easy race, but I think that if we can win in Alabama, we can win in Pennsylvania in a district that was Trump plus 20, we can absolutely win in Massachusetts with Elizabeth Warren on the ballot and with some terrific gubernatorial candidates on the ballot if we do the hard work of articulating our vision of the future and of having a truly grassroots campaign. So I think that an office holder like the lieutenant governor succeeds if the state succeeds. So I want to see Massachusetts move forward and be a leader on some of the issues that affect ordinary people. And so I want us to move forward and fix our broken transportation system, fix our broken criminal justice system. I want to see us really invest in education and in particular reforming our broken Chapter 70 formula. I want to see us be a leader on climate change, which we're not under Charlie Baker and Karen Polito. I want to see us really lean into trying to come up with real solutions to this opioid crisis. So there are a number of specific issues where I'd really like to see the Commonwealth succeed. But my own personal legacy, my career has been focused on the fight against poverty and inequality. And so I see myself as a champion for those kinds of issues within the administration. And I would like to work with the governor and the legislature, the cabinet, but also with cities and towns, with communities all across the Commonwealth to really grapple with the challenges that face ordinary people and that face the poorest members of our society. Because we have this social crisis. I worked in President Obama's White House, and he saw rising inequality as one of the great social policy challenges of our time. And we've traveled all across the Commonwealth, and that's what we see. There's so many ways in which we look at the top line for Massachusetts. We've got a low unemployment rate, or we've got a GDP that's growing, or we have very high test scores, but we also have some really dramatic disparities. We have disparities in terms of opportunity in the educational system. We have disparities in terms of access to transportation. We have very hard-hit communities with respect to environmental problems and the opioid crisis. We have very serious challenges in terms of housing affordability and affordability of college. And so I think that we ought to think about trying to build an economy that works for everyone, and make sure that our prosperity as a state is shared across socioeconomic lines, and that we really take on some of the racial disparities that we see in the education system, the housing system, at the healthcare system, and across the landscape. I also want to move forward with a single payer system. I think that we need to reform our healthcare system. I think single payer is the way to do it. And I think that Massachusetts has been a leader on health reform in the past, and we can do that again. So it's a terrific question, and it's a really important distinction between where Charlie Baker and Karen Polito have been on education and where I think that the Democratic candidates for governor and I would like to take this Commonwealth. The first thing is we need to reform the Chapter 70 formula because there are too many communities that are laying off teachers and where children are not getting the opportunity to have a first-class education. And I think that when you get into the specifics of Chapter 70 reform, first of all, we just need more revenue. And we need to account for English language learners in the school system. We need to account for special needs children. We need to account for children that are leaving the public school system and going into the charter school system. And we also need to account for the fact that in some areas people have a lot of challenges in their communities, and they come to the school system and they need to catch up. And so I think we need to invest in our Chapter 70 reform effort. And this is one of the areas where I think that there's a very significant significant difference, which is that we want to pass a millionaire's tax and get the revenue to invest in the public school system. And Charlie Baker really just wants to tinker around the edges. This week there was a study that came, or there were test results that came out, and they show exactly what we've been seeing for a while, which is that the very top level, the test scores for Massachusetts public school children are on average very high. We're the best in the nation. But we ought not to be satisfied with that, because the other thing that we see in those numbers is some of the worst disparities. I've actually done some writing on school finance and the importance of making sure that every child has free and appropriate public education. It's a constitutional mandate, and it's also a civil rights imperative. While we're on the topic of education, there are a few other things that I'd like to mention that I'd like to do. One is we ought to invest in making college and higher education more affordable for everyone across the Commonwealth. And this is one of the areas where I think we'd like to use some of the money from the millionaire's tax to invest in college affordability, because we're bankrupting a generation of young people. I met a couple a few weeks ago. They have $130,000 worth of debt. They're delaying having a family. They're delaying buying a house. I think that's very typical, and shame on us for letting that obstacle stand in the way of folks participating in this economy and living the American dream. We ought to do more in the pre-K area. We want to make universal pre-K and child care. And that's another area where we're going to need more resources, and we need to be honest that we're going to need to raise more revenue to invest in those things. And then finally, I've been very interested from my days in the White House and through my work at the Poverty Lab at MIT on making sure that we take advantage of the possibility that educational technology poses for personalization in learning, giving teachers and students the tools that they need to really maximize their learning potential. I think that technology is going to transform education in some of the ways that it's transformed some other sectors like healthcare and the economy, but we're not there yet. Too often we've invested in technology in school systems and not gotten the results that we'd like to see. The Los Angeles and Newark are two examples of school systems that invested a lot of money on the promise of integrating technology into the school system, didn't get the results that we'd like to see. We need to be smart about it. We need to study it. We need to pilot new approaches to incorporating personalization and technology into pedagogy, and then learning from the experiences of school systems, and then building on successes and tweaking where we don't get the results that we would like to do. So I think it's important to sort of think about laboratories and innovation, because I think that technology and personalization have the potential really not only to maximize the potential of our students that have the most opportunities, but also to get to minimize these really horrible divides between some of the poorest students and some of our racial minorities and the highest performing schools. That's a real challenge for our democracy, and I think technology and personalization have the potential to be a part of the solution to that as long as we study it. So let me sort of separate the challenge of the sort of longer-term homeless from some of the housing affordability challenges that are faced across Massachusetts, because I think in some ways the policy solutions are a little bit different. First, with the very poorest folks in the system, I think that we need to invest more resources in making sure that there's enough emergency housing, and then transitioning people into longer-term housing. The emergency short-term solutions right now are underfunded. So if you look at the very coldest period of time, you remember that really awful cold snap we had in late December, early January. A lot of those homeless shelters in our urban areas were over capacity. We should never let that happen. We need to also invest the resources in trying to solve the challenges that are causing homelessness. So we need to do a better job of investing in mental and behavioral health. We need to do a better job of investing in substance use disorder treatment. We need to be doing a whole better job in terms of making sure that there are the skills to participate in the labor market, and that we're providing social services and education and training opportunities for folks as they move into longer-term supported housing. We also need to make sure that there is enough low-income housing available in the stock, and that's one of the real challenges that we face. The legislature has been taking this on a little bit with a bond bill, but I think that we just need more low-income housing. And the housing stock needs to increase, and that's going to require some additional resources. But all across the socioeconomic spectrum, too many people work really hard and still have trouble making ends meet. And part of that in this economy is that our housing is extraordinarily expensive. If you think of the polling on the most recent mayor's race, it was the #1 issue that people described as their challenge within Boston. And so we do need to make sure that as a system-wide matter that we increase the housing stock, we increase the resources available to subsidize housing, and that we make sure that we're helping with care coordination and management as people navigate the Section 8 system and the private market. Let's start with sort of how this began. I think that there have been a series of Republican policies over the course of a couple of decades that have exacerbated a trend towards income inequality. And the Trump administration is a great example of sort of supercharging that. So the tax scam that they passed a couple of months ago takes from the very poorest and the middle class and gives to the very, very wealthiest members of our society, to large corporations. And there's been a series of economic policies, from tax policy towards deregulation, that have really supercharged a trend that was already happening within our economy. And I think that one of the consequences of this is that our economy, our economic growth, is not being shared evenly across our society. And so even when you see the top level numbers being good, we have a low unemployment rate or high GDP growth, a lot of people don't feel that. And I think that one of the reasons I'm so excited about the Raise Up Massachusetts agenda of raising the minimum wage and the paid family leave and of the millionaire's tax, investing in transportation and education is that it's a little bit of a start on pushing back against some of those challenges. I think when you talk about income inequality and you talk about race, they're obviously interrelated problems. Certainly people of color are more often than not they're more likely to be on the lower end of the income spectrum. But I think it's very important not to look at those problems as identical. There are challenges that are faced by communities of color that are the result of intentional discrimination. I've spent a lot of time in my career working on election reforms and on voter suppression. And the fact is that the Republicans, there have been a series of policies over a long period of time that have made it harder for people to register and vote, particularly communities of color. And that creates a real challenge and a real attack on our democracy. There are, I was on the Council on Racial Disparities when I was the chief of the healthcare division, the Attorney General's office, and we see in the healthcare system very significant disparities on racial lines, both in terms of access to healthcare and in terms of the results that folks see from their interactions with the healthcare system or the public health system. You certainly see that within the education system. The ways in which residential segregation continues to exist, both in Massachusetts and across the country, really exacerbate some of these real challenges in terms of disparities in educational opportunity and attainment. We live in very segregated communities, and then there are also very significant differences in terms of the resources that are provided for those communities on the educational side. Environmental protection is another area where environmental justice issues, the people who are usually hit hardest and first by climate change and by pollution and by a failure of the administration to really regulate some of those and lead on climate change issues, the people who are always hit first are communities of color. And so I want to make sure that we're being a champion for poor people. I want to make sure that we're being a champion for civil rights and eliminating racial disparities. And I also want to make sure that we don't conflate those two challenges because they're interrelated, but they're distinct. One of the wonderful things about Massachusetts is we have a very educated workforce. We have wonderful universities. We've been a leader on so many of these issues, and it's understandable that these businesses would want to come here, and we really want them to come here. It's very exciting to be able to lure some of those jobs here. At the same time, as we think about giving tax incentives for corporations to come into Massachusetts, we need to make sure that everybody gets a good deal out of that. So if you're going to give a tax incentive, you want to make sure that what's coming back is an investment in our communities, and not just in the high wage earners, but also that those jobs are going to be spread across communities of color, across people who are struggling to make ends meet, that those corporations are investing in the communities that they're coming into. And so I think that it's a delicate balance. We need to make sure that we are getting a good bargain, but we absolutely do want to use carrots to try to bring businesses into our economy. The other thing I think we ought to think about as we're crafting economic development policy is some of the ways in which the economy is changing. So automation is changing our workforce, and we're going to see a lot of people dislocated as a result of transitions in our economy. We ought not to be surprised by this. We need to be putting in place policies now that create relationships between our community colleges and our regional employment boards and our VOTEC schools and employers, either employers that are coming in for the first time or employers who have been in our cities and towns for a long time, to make sure that we are preparing people in our workforce for the jobs that employers are creating, and that employers are communicating with our educational system and our employment system about what they need. Because I think that that's one of the real challenges. You know, if you have AI, that's going to displace a lot of current jobs. You also see, you know, driverless cars. That's going to displace a lot of drivers, whether that be truck drivers or Uber drivers or taxi drivers. And we need to be preparing for those challenges now. I've mentioned that economic inequality has been the focus of my career and is one of the great social policy challenges of our time. But climate change is an existential threat to our planet. And the contrast between where Democrats have been on wrestling with a set of issues and where the Republican Party is couldn't be more stark. I was in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. My boss was the president's science advisor. And we were really focused on making sure that good science was driving the policies that we put in place. That couldn't be more different from the way that President Trump has addressed climate change. He's pulled out of the Paris Agreement and has been dismantling the EPA and regulations and really kowtowing to polluters. At home, it's not much better. Charlie Baker gets credit for having said that we should be in the Paris Agreement and for some of his regional activities to cooperate with other states. But he has failed to lead on one of the key challenges of our time, whether that is in building a clean energy economy, because of course we have the resources in Massachusetts. We've got this wonderful technology sector, universities, and we could really be leading on wind, on solar, on geothermal, and the state government is not helping those sectors to blossom. Secondly, there's too much deregulation. We need a Department of Environmental Protection that is really leaning in to trying to help build a green energy economy and regulate pollution. And then on decisions like pipelines, the governor is taking us in the wrong direction. So I think that we need to lean in all of those areas. I also think that we need to seriously look at the possibility of carbon taxation. I think that this is a mechanism that would allow us both to raise some revenues, but also to align the incentives of our citizens and our businesses with what we need to do for the climate. Now, so much of this challenge is already here. As we see these severe weather events, and we're sitting here on April 15th when we just had a snowstorm, and what everybody has said is that some of the first signs of these challenges are already here, these extreme weather events. And so we do need to be thinking about climate mitigation, and we need to be thinking about using MEMA and FEMA and working with our communities and businesses to deal with the challenges that are already here. And I do think it's important as you think about who you want to elect as a lieutenant governor to be able to picture somebody who can handle a crisis situation if the need arises. You see them in a bunker in a situation where a city is facing a real crisis and being equipped to face those challenges, because we're going to have more and more of these kinds of challenges. This is a core set of issues that we need to lean forward on. First of all, we need to be steadfast in our commitment to reproductive rights. One of the things that we've seen over the past couple of decades since Casey versus Planned Parenthood is an erosion of those rights at the state level. We need a governor and a lieutenant governor who are absolutely committed to reproductive rights and freedoms, and who are going to protect those both in the legislative role of speaking with the legislature, and also in terms of appointing judges who understand the 14th Amendment and understand the right to privacy and are going to uphold those values. But the issues facing women are not limited to reproductive rights. We need to make sure that we're leaning in on eliminating the pay gap. It's absolutely shameful that women earn pennies on the dollar compared to men who are equally qualified. We've made some progress on that legislatively, but we really need to make sure that as we implement those laws, we honor what the intent of those laws were, and make sure that works. We need paid family leave because you shouldn't have to choose between having a family and caring for loved ones and your career, and that's one of the core principles of the Raise Up movement. We need to pass that and really believe in it. The Me Too movement, I think you need a governor and a lieutenant governor who are going to be allies and advocates for reforms that will help protect people from the kind of discrimination, harassment. Shame on society for allowing so much discrimination and harassment to be so pervasive for so long. And we're at a watershed moment in that movement. We need a governor and a lieutenant governor who will lean in on that. Last week there was also a rally at the State House led by young people who were insisting on better protections on campus against campus rape and assault. We ought to do more with our universities and colleges to make sure that we're keeping those folks safe. I'm a very strong believer in the Healthy Youth Act, which is a piece of legislation now being considered on Beacon Hill that ensures that if you have a sex ed classroom, that the curriculum is one that is comprehensive and gives people the tools to understand how to live healthy lives in relationships that also take on issues like bullying and counter some of the behaviors that have made the Me Too movement so necessary. We also need to lean into protecting our LGBTQ friends. On the ballot this year, unfortunately, is a shocking and awful attempt to repeal the progress that we've made in Massachusetts. And it's also a little bit of a confusing piece of legislation or a ballot initiative referendum because the yes position is actually to maintain the status quo. And so I hope that we can make sure that voters understand that in leading on civil rights, we need to vote yes on that referendum. So let me first take on the question of what more we can do on guns, and then let me talk a little bit about how excited I am about this movement of young people stepping up and taking control and leaning into really influencing the political conversation. But on the issue of guns, how we got here is because of our broken campaign finance system. We have a system that allows the NRA to have too much control over members of Congress, and as a result, those folks have failed to deal with this shocking set of tragedies, even in the most rudimentary of ways. One of the great things about being in Massachusetts is that we do have a better set of gun laws, and we've had better results. But we shouldn't congratulate ourselves too much. We need to do better. And there are three things that I'd like to see us do right away. The first is there's an extreme risk protective order bill that is now being considered in the legislature. I hope it will get passed. And what this will allow folks to do is, if there's a member of their family who represents a risk to themselves or to others, it'll give an opportunity for a concerned person to come forward and ask for the court system to take away that gun for a period of time. This would have had a very significant impact in the Parkland scenario, but it also would have a huge impact on the largest cause of gun violence that we face in Massachusetts, which is suicide. So most of the gun deaths in our Commonwealth are from suicides, and the extreme risk protective order would be a meaningful step forward on that. Second thing that I'd like to mention is the importance of evidence and data. So one of the really awful things that the Republicans in Congress have done is this Dickey Amendment. So the Dickey Amendment is a piece of legislation or provision that has been interpreted to prohibit the Center for Disease Control, the CDC, from investing money in studies of gun violence as a public health challenge. As a result of the way that's been interpreted, we know much, much less about gun violence and what works to counter it than we do about other public health challenges like obesity or diabetes or smoking. And that's exactly the opposite of how we ought to develop good policy. When I was at MIT, I ran the Poverty Lab, JPAL North America, and the basic notion was that we should actually treat public policy like science. We should learn what works, we should study it and share knowledge, and then we should craft policy based on evidence and data. That was also a core value of the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the White House where I worked. What the federal government has created is a climate for gun policy is exactly the opposite of what we should be doing. I think Massachusetts can lead on remedying some of that gap in terms of our understanding about what works in fighting gun violence. California has committed $5 million to these studies. I think that Massachusetts could join with other states and also bring foundations and philanthropies and businesses to the table to create research that will help us to address those challenges. And then finally, there has been a move at the federal level for concealed carry reciprocity, which would impose upon Massachusetts an obligation to respect the laws of other states where they allow people to do things that we in our judgment have decided are going to put a risk to our community. We ought to push back against that. Maura Healey has been a wonderful leader on gun violence, and the governor and the lieutenant governor ought to stand shoulder to shoulder with her. But let me just mention briefly how excited I am to see young people stepping up. The Parkland students are one example of what I think is a larger movement. And I've seen, we've been talking with young people. I was talking with some young people in Gloucester this morning, and young people are stepping up to claim control of their destiny. And it's unfortunate that our generation has not solved some of these problems, but we really see young people all across the country who are leaning in to build a grassroots movement. And if we think about what happened with the Trump presidency, we woke up the morning after he was elected and found that we had not only lost the presidency, but the Senate, the House, the governorships, the state legislatures, and the courts. And if you think about how we're going to claw our way out of that mess, it's going to be to take a page out of the Republican playbook. With the Christian Coalition and with the Newt Gingrich revolution of the Tea Party, they invested in running people for local offices, for statewide offices all across the country. And we need to think about how to build on this momentum with young people to try to do exactly the same thing. So I'm proud to be one of 40 political appointees in the Obama administration who are running for office this year all across the country. You see young people, you see people of color, you see women running in record numbers to play a role in this conversation. If you look at young people and their views in even the deepest red states, their views are much more progressive. So the future is ours. The future is going to be much more diverse and much more progressive, but we need to lean in and invest in the grassroots this year and now to make sure that we can take back some of these statewide offices like the governor's office and the office of the lieutenant governor, as well as Congress and as well as our legislatures.